Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, and Sabina Higgins. You're all very welcome. Under the President of Ireland's Ethics Initiative, the Irish Centre for Human Rights and the College of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences at NUI Galway are hosting this one-day meeting on the human right to health. As well as the Irish Centre for Human Rights and the College of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences, we have students from both groups. We have a group of students for health equality from the School of Medicine helping to organise this event. What's going to happen in the next while is, first of all, we're going to have some opening remarks from the President of NUI Galway, Dr. Jim Brown. The President of Ireland is going to give us an address. Then Professor Michael O'Flaherty will introduce the first session and introduce the first keynote speaker, Professor Sophia Gruskin. Can I ask people to turn off your mobile phones, please? There will be a coffee break at about 11:15, and we'll tell you you can see what happens for the rest of the day on the programme that you have. So you're all very welcome. Thank you.
A Uachtaráin, a Hachtadála, a Colacha, a Corja agus a Ina Galéir. While I'm reduced fáilte fé choibh Galéir go dtí an ócáid súnsaach seo agus an symposium táhachtach seo. President of Ireland Michael D. Higgins, Mrs. Higgins, TDs, distinguished visitors, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As President of NUI Galway, it's my great privilege to welcome all of you here this morning to this very important symposium which focuses on the human right to health. We're particularly honoured to be joined by the President and Mrs. Higgins for this very important event, which of course is part of the President's Ethics Initiative. This Ethics Initiative is an important one which we in NUI Galway are very delighted and very happy to participate in. I want to also extend a special welcome to Emily Logan and Les Allenby, who are the leaders of the Human Rights Commissions of Ireland and Northern Ireland respectively. They join us here today and will participate in the first panel session. I want to also welcome our keynote speakers and panel participants, distinguished academics, clinicians, analysts, and lead representatives of various NGOs. Céad Míle Fáilte of Galéir go Jill Scoil na HÉir an Gaillimh ar an Maidin seo. Welcome to NUI Galway this morning. I know many of you have come from long distances to be here, from South Carolina, from Riga, from Nottingham, all to come to this fine event. So on behalf of the delegates and the organisers, I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us and for taking the time to travel with us today. I want to also say that this event is being live streamed, so I want to also welcome those who are watching this in the virtual reality world. You are also welcome to participate, and I hope you enjoy the event. This event, as I said, has been organised as part of the President of Ireland's Ethics Initiative. It is the fourth such event in NUI Galway as part of this initiative. And that initiative was established by President Higgins, and I quote his reason for doing so. I think it's important to understand this. Develop a public discourse that places human flourishing and an ethic of active citizenship at its heart. End of quote. Through his many speeches over the past number of years, President Higgins has explored the importance of ethics in Irish life and Irish public life particularly. His initiative is welcome, and it's intended to engage citizens in critically thinking about ethics and the challenge of living ethically in the modern world. Irish universities and higher education institutions have embraced this lecture series. Over 50 events have either been held or are planned under the initiative. Today's event focuses on the human right to health. It is organised by Dr. Jim Donovan from our School of Medicine and Professor Michael O'Flaherty, the Director of our Irish Centre for Human Rights. I think it represents a tremendous collaboration between two traditionally disparate disciplines, law and medicine, and I certainly welcome that. brings together a very fine and impressive group of speakers and panellists to address an issue which I think is very critical, the issue of addressing and delivering healthcare fairly and equitably, and doing that through a human rights framework. Quite a discussion is now developing on this theme, the link between human rights and health, and how human rights concepts might be used to address the challenges of delivering healthcare equitably, in Ireland indeed and beyond. There's a growing debate globally on this matter, and the attempt to conflate, I think, human rights and healthcare, I think, is an interesting effort, and one which I think will bear fruit as we address this very important debate. It's clear that human rights has the potential to deliver some interesting insights into the ethical delivery of healthcare and the ensuring that our citizens have access to improved health and well-being. That is more important as we realise as all governments and indeed even private sector organisations are constrained in terms of their ability to pay for the huge costs of improving healthcare. And no doubt a human rights prism will offer a tremendous potential, help us to address that debate and deliver a fair result. I think our university is also well positioned to, if you like, address that issue. We have in recent years established some very important and well-regarded research centres in areas such as disability law and policy, social gerontology and ageing, health economics, child and family research, autism and neurodevelopmental research, among others. These efforts have now been combined to a single, if you like, institute in the university, the Institute for Life Course and Society. That institute will bring together all those various disparate groups to work together to help to develop an evidence base for policy. And that group has been privileged to move into a new facility on the north of the campus, a new facility literally constructed in the past year and opened in the last couple of months and funded largely by philanthropy. So I think that institute has something to say on this issue and something which I think will contribute to the debate. Then alongside that institute, we also have our Irish Centre for Human Rights, which has a well-established reputation for its efforts over the years, both nationally and globally, to develop human rights and to bring a scholarly approach to human rights issues. That, the Human Rights Centre, our Life Course Institute, our Whitaker Institute, and indeed our School of Law, together, I think, bring together a tremendous corpus of individuals and expertise and a range of expertise to allow us to address this important issue in a sensible and I think in a productive way. I look forward to emerging ideas from those institutes and indeed from this seminar, which will influence and hopefully inform public policy as we go forward. So can I conclude then by again welcoming President Higgins, the various eminent speakers who will address this important issue. I want to also wish the seminar and the symposium every success. I thank all of those involved in the organisation of it. And I will conclude by simply quoting from you the vision that President Higgins has laid out for his ethics initiative. Let me quote, "It is my hope the discourse on ethics will be a source of extensive public debates and meet the expectations of citizens for such values as will enable us to build a sustainable social economy and a society which is profoundly ethical and inclusive." I certainly echo those aspirations, and this university will do whatever it can to bring those aspirations to reality. I wish you every success with this seminar. Cormail Maggie. Thank you very much.
So please welcome Uachtar Onahir and Michael D. Higgins.
Well, gynnu cwrdd ohys ar feresh Gloucester Hills gan yn gael agos is min la mawicus y gwol nam Dr. Michael Flaherty has sagt yn cwira agos dirmad o dwnawan has sagt yn cwira at hiol shit lam. President and members of the Oireachtas, dear friends, and all of those who have travelled, it's a very great pleasure for me to return to the National University of Ireland Galway at any time, and especially to participate in this important conference hosted by the College of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences and the Irish Centre for Human Rights, where of course I was an adjunct professor for a short while. I want to say I want to thank all of those who've welcomed me here in the past through the year. Maybe one word about the ethics initiative. I had said that the presidency that I would be participating in for 7 years would be a presidency of ideas. Therefore, that I would take on a number of themes that were ones that were not confined to the legislative response of the day, but rather were ones that affected, as I felt it, the future in the long term, also affected the structure of society, and particularly the connection between the society and such dimensions of living as ethics, economics, ecology, and so on. We have just passed, I think, the 60 figure now in that ethics initiative, because it began where the resources were, which was in the universities. And there have been, for example, later on this year I will open, and there will be opening of a new faculty in University College Cork with the brave title, the Faculty of Moral Economy, which those of you who understand economics will know how brave that is. But it is one of the outcomes of the ethics initiative. We've had conversations with the Vincent de Paul, who are dealing on a day-to-day basis with the poor. They are having an internal conversation with the Wheel, which is a huge number of organisations that are affiliated to it. The Congress of Trade Unions are running a whole question in relation to the world of work. And in addition to that, it has operated on an all-island basis with events from Queen's University in Coleraine to practically all of the different universities and institutes of technology, including the ethics of journalism, the ethics of film, and so forth. I will, at the end, have a seminar in the end of March, which will draw all of the themes together. But then the important thing is that, as I've said, it's in October. Students will be able to enroll in a new faculty that is the outcome of the initiative. But I was very conscious when I was bringing that as the second initiative. My first was originally called Being Young in Ireland, and I changed it to Being Young and Irish because so many young people were outside of Ireland. So the first one had a conversation that engaged with 800 young people in detail, including young people in prisons, people in all forms of life. The second initiative, which is the ethics initiative. And then next year I will roll on to topic number 3, which is a closely guarded secret. I want, what I have to say this morning is prepared in 2 different ways. When I was involved with the President of Ireland, when I announced it first, many people contacted me, and some said that they were training to be ethicists. And I thought about this, and it is very important to draw a distinction between a discussion of ethics in the Kantian sense, one might say, and then ethics in relation as a frame into which you would put economics, and ethicists, which is a long spectrum in many ways, how to behave properly according to, let us say, a protocol. And at the other end of that spectrum might be how to make sure you're not caught. So there is a distinction between, if you like, the narrow version and the more challenging version. So as I said, I prepared my paper in 2 ways. One which I hope I may have something to say about the importance of a seminar like this, and I so wish the seminar well. I hope it is vibrant, and I hope that you get so much from it, and even more questions, and that it continues on. But I also decided, because at this stage now, having attended many human rights its discussions, discourses, and present and giving lectures, I think one is tested morally and as an intellectual in present circumstances. I think some people came to talk to me earlier on about ethics, and they expressed their general dissatisfaction with the world, with the academy, and with everything, apart from themselves. And this had an effect in a way. So I think we are in conditions of enormous change. And I want today to try and address some of the contradictions, for example, that I feel are not sufficiently, are not getting sufficient attention. The gap between the literal revolution that is going on in economic theory is not being connected to the human rights discourse. Equally, I hold the personal view that the human rights discourse is far more fragile now than it was, let us say, in what I would call the glorious days of the 1990s. I remember being present in Vienna when, in fact, the stamp of human rights was going to be firmly imprinted in practically every form of our lives together. We're very far from that. We are living, if you like, amidst the ruins of shattered paradigms of economy and connections between economy and society. But at the same time, there's a great invitation. We're on the edge of discussing these in the most fundamental way. So we'll see in the, for example, the sustainable, what will be sustainable development goals, which will come to an end in September. And then at the end of this year itself, the big conference in Paris on climate change. You cannot ignore context in all of these applied discussions, it seems to me. But to make a beginning, I think that it is, today is especially the importance of this topic, the question of health and the right to health, is a subject of great currency. And I think that I want to thank the President of National University of Ireland, Galway, and to all the staff and to all students and others who have participated, and I thank you for your initiatives. I had very much Amartya Sen's view in mind when I began this initiative too. I think picking from his work a phrase like flourishing or defining equality in terms of the right to participate without shame in your society and to participate fully. I looked at Martha Nussbaum's work and I looked at both of their work in relation to capacity. And I felt that it brought me very far, but stopped short of a full realization of citizenship. And I think in both the university and the community events, themes of social justice and access to basic human rights, such as the right to health, they have been prominent in the discussion, and that's good. I think it reflects an increasingly lively debate on the possibility of affording constitutional protection to economic, social and cultural rights in Ireland. I'll say in a moment, most recently I've been in Africa, in Ethiopia and Malawi and South Africa, but in South Africa, where I had an opportunity of thinking about the South African Constitution, but also meeting members of the court. There is a debate about what South Africa should have done. Should South Africa have constructed a document which could have been achievable, and people in the news media and others could have said they've achieved this and achieved that? Or should it have as a constitution an inspirational document that invited people to the best of themselves, and of course to cause you much more trouble, because what it would in fact mean is that you would be continually tested against it. I am one of those who think that they were right to have a document that invited people to a transformational sense of themselves and of institutions and of society. And I think I refer to that. But we here in Ireland, the Constitution Review Group recommended against such protection in its report in 1996. Being very clear, should we afford constitutional protection to economic, social and cultural rights in Ireland, their recommendation was no. And then after that, since 1996, there has been a growing interest in the area in the past decade. And there have been contributions from the Irish Human Rights Commission, as it then was. I recall giving the very last lecture to the Commission, Amnesty International, FLAC, and a very wide range of NGOs. After that came the Constitutional Convention that ultimately recommended the constitutional protection of a number of economic, social and cultural rights, including a recommendation of 87% of the members that the Constitution should include a right to essential health care. Leaving aside the discussion on what a word is essential for the moment, it sets up an interesting introduction to the contradiction that is at the heart of what we are about. And that is, you have, as it were, a citizen's support of 87% for something. But at the same time, you have to then not be afraid to ask the question, why can't it be? And if you're unwilling to go outside of the silo of human rights and address the issues of economic rights, you're not able to begin to answer the question. I think that this suggests to me a neat illustration of a current and unavoidable contradiction, the dilemma of elected governments within democratic systems seeking to respond to citizens' articulated, seeking, in one sense, we've just heard 87% are in favour of such a right, but at the same time forced to stay within the lock of what might be called the invisible fist of markets that are neither democratic nor are accountable in any sense. In a way, as I have been looking more and more at the new material, it becomes clear to me that this contradiction is the contradiction of our times. The space of discretion that is available to elected governments that come from the democratic system is getting ever more narrowed. It is now true in every one of the OECD countries. At the same time, a number of significant things are happening. We are in conditions of diminished growth, there are maturation of welfare states, and the population is aging. As well as that, unemployment levels are changing into structural unemployment levels, and because of the contraction in spending, people who are in tax brackets, who are moving from one bracket up to another, are not moving, so therefore that has an effect on revenue, and you have lower nominal growth rates. So therefore, you're in a bind. What this is, of course, I will not be continuing to, because I have this issue addressed in other papers, and I will be addressing it substantially when I give the Phelan lecture at the ILO. But this has created an issue where the public need is established, the public support for addressing the need is established, but you have a bind or a lock within which governments, who are in turn elected by people, and before people rush and immediately say, well, we know whose side we're on, it isn't as easy as that, because a considerable part of the public, in this lock in which they find themselves, are both creditors and citizens. Many of them are relying for their income from pensions, from pension funds that ever since the elimination of the Glass-Steagall Act have in fact found their way as trash products made their way into pension funds, and from pension funds into central banks. And central banks in turn have behaved in ways in which they didn't feel themselves free in a deregulated sense to question the lock in which they find themselves. And the language as a result is insufficient. Thus, what you get as a kind of response in panic are questions of restructuring, a use of words like, well, this is globalization, which is a status rather like the flu, but is in fact really the globalization of capital markets, and also capital markets composed of ever more speculative finance as opposed to finance used for investment. I also, the notion as well is that maybe if everyone lived on less, you could achieve this, possibly called, you have the phrase used, flexible labour markets, and you could have, as it were, the liberalisation of different things. I only say globalisation then, as politics very often, as we have some people here, and I'm no longer involved as a party political person, but what I notice around Europe and what I notice across the OECD countries, as you can't do anything much meaningful about this, political discussion and presentation becomes a kind of spectacle. So you have the spectacles, the family photograph of the heads of state, and other things like that, the arrival and the departure of significant figures, and so forth. All of it, from the discourse that is required, and that is why I'm saying this in a university, because universities have a crucial role to play in addressing what I might call this institutionalized austerity. I think as well there's, if you like, as in fact things get tough for all those in the world of speculative capital, they have forced back to live on the circumstances that new debt replacing old debt suggests. So all of this then in many cases, to sum up, is to say there is a context that is economic and fiscal that stands as a great shadow behind everything that we have to discuss. And it is long past time that we moved the human rights discourse out of the limiting silo of law and into the more general area. I'm now getting on with the paper that I originally wrote and for which those who work with me will be able to breathe more easily. As President, of course, it is not appropriate for me to take a position on whether the Constitution should be amended to address this issue of the 87% who want a human right in relation to health. But I do, as I said, very interested in both provoking, contributing and commenting on the rich debate that has flowed from those discussions, both from the Commission and also from the Convention. I do as well, I think there is a certain reluctance as well to engage with what I call exogenous factors. That is, summarising everything I've just said now, the economic frame in which they are forced to tacitly, as it were, to forced to function. And in that way, when people speak about scholarship, we have moved on, I think, intellectually to a point where one has to accept that what is endogenous to your own particular discipline must be continually changing critically to take account of what I say exogenous factors. Leaving aside then the question of constitutional protection of economic, social and cultural rights at the national level, the international obligations on this island are clear. Let me finish my other point, though, about what I meant about people who are on both sides of the fence. In large countries like the United States, for example, you have people who have invested, as I said, in pension funds. In a sense, in the discourse, they are part of they are creditors in one sense, and yet at the same time, in terms of what they need, they're citizens. And one of the reasons why you haven't had, as I think, this confrontation in the scholarship is because of that. There's a kind of numbness that has set in relation to social policy. I think in relation to the international obligations of Ireland, there is a right to health under international law. It's set out in treaties in which the state is a party, including, of course, the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, which Ireland ratified in 1990, and under which Ireland will be examined before the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights later this year. So there can be no doubt that our interaction with that committee and the other relevant treaty monitoring bodies under the United Nations and Council of Europe treaties has enlivened our legal discourse about rights, including the right to health. But it is fair to say that up to this point, the national discourse around the concepts of economic and social rights has been largely conducted, as I have said, within the disciplines of law and human rights. I have already said, and the purpose of my paper is to suggest that we need to deepen the connections between that discourse in this field and the wider emerging discourse in the fields of economics and social policy about health and related social goods. When I'm making these points, I'm drawing very much, I know, on some of the work of, for example, Armin Schaefer and Wolfgang Streeck, and in their new book, well, it's now nearly 2 years old, Politics in the Age of Austerity, they do suggest that this is leading to a threat to democracy itself by the new conditions in which European states find themselves. Pause and think for a moment of what I have said. As functions and powers leach in an institutional sense from governments that are elected democratically, as governments find themselves, as I say, in the invisible fist that has reduced discretionary spending. As populations grow and human need expands and so forth, what are the consequences of that kind of impotence? They are many and they are already observable. I think as well that it is worth bearing all of this in mind. Complex questions then of justiciability, they take on a different hue in the conditions that I describe. That question of justiciability and how policy making can address the financial challenges of realising these rights, it provides the starting point, I think, for a very productive conversation between human rights, economics and social policy. And I think that the absence of this conversation threatens democracy itself. And I congratulate those universities who are facilitating such an integrated conversation. In October, I participated in a seminar hosted by the Institute for International Economic Affairs, European Affairs, with Edward and Robert Skidelsky to discuss their book, How Much Is Enough? That book was essentially a conversation between a political economist and a philosopher, a joint exercise between a father and a son. I think the father won in that. And it looks at the distinction between basic human needs and human wants, arguing that in its economic policy and structures, the state should approach and regulate both categories in different ways. How Much Is Enough, their book, reminds us too of a time when Western political economy was grounded in philosophical and ethical thought, and economic policy was conceptualized primarily in relation to the social objectives at which it was aimed. And I'm going much farther now in these most recent statements of mine, beyond, for example, Amartya Sen's rewriting of the preface to the Theory of Moral Sentiments. We have to do much more than that. The Skidelskis are just part of a growing cohort of economists, still a very significant minority, and political theorists who are turning to re-examine and reconfigure the manner in which we view the essential social goods within our economic theory. I think when I was preparing this too, I was realised very much from Africa, realising that the North-South discourse isn't so useful anymore, because of course the South, with all its deprivations, is now in the North and reflected in the unemployment, the poverty, the housing and all of the other needs. And at the same time, aspects of the North is in the South, where initiatives have taken place that confine economic benefits to the elites, who are in fact not necessarily distributing results to the population in general. It is my conviction that the discourse of human rights has a great deal to offer in forging these new models of economy and society and how they are constructed, as economics is in fact will be forced to return its ethical grounding. It can do this, I think, in terms of being forced to do so by neglected conflicts, or it can do so by choosing to do so through informed discourses. This has very particular relevance to the specific question of the right of health, because it is so inextricably linked to considerations of human dignity and engages all dimensions of life and community, as well as questions of equality and respect for diversity. Reading as I do reports and conferences on human rights, but dignity is interesting insofar it is the core word upon which everyone falls back. It's also a very interesting word insofar as it crosses most of the different belief systems and ethical systems. But I think the clear collision between what was an aggressive assertion of intellectual property rights, for example, and rights to health is revealed in the case, for example, of retroviral drugs and health treatment in South Africa. At one level in Geneva, the office that is there for the protection, in a market sense, of intellectual rights to property is very well resourced. What do you do then when, for example, in India, a law is passed saying that no previous agreement, international or otherwise, in fact can interfere with a right to an essential element of health? And this debate takes place as well in Brazil and so forth. But in it you can see you would be how could you not see the collision between the aggressive protection of what are very, very fragile, to be argued, for example, the attempt to have intellectual property rights not only on a product, but on process, and then also, in its absurd sense, a tree itself in the Amazon, in one sense. And at the same time, people dying who could have benefited from retroviral drugs. And the interesting side of it is, you can say, you can just note it, but it is there. And it is up to those who are interested in taking part in the public discourse to change it. It made a big change in South Africa. And as we will hear from the speakers and panellists this morning, consideration of health and healthcare involves questions of science, questions of economics, and questions of ethics, questions of ecology. A human rights framework, I believe, provides a paradigm where these perspectives can all be considered in a transparent and rational manner. The reason I have given the South African example, because I visited recently and I had the opportunity of discussing with its constitutional court and some members. And I was greatly interested to observe there how judicial protection of the right to health has been used in countries such as South Africa, as I've said, to engage with complex issues of healthcare, budgeting, and provision, in particular of the example I used, retroviral care. But of course, the South African experience shows that formal legal protection of the right to health will not in itself resolve profound poverty and structural inequality. The realization of the right to health and of related rights such as the right to housing, to adequate food and nutrition, to access clean water and sanitation, to a clean and safe environment remain essentially political matters. Everything is political. Legal and constitutional rights can be the tools for the achievement of human dignity, but political leadership and democratic debate is also required. But I stress these contradictions that I noted in those authors by Schaeffer and Streeck. And many who vote, as I've said, are both creditors and citizens, and many are simply not engaged. I do, however, think of the warning after the debt conference in Toronto of Julius Nyerere, who had been travelling the world. And he said, what we have got is a technocratic package, yet again about debt. But we have made no progress in taking the bold political decision that might address these issues. And this year in particular, we cannot have more of the same. As a Swiss ambassador writing home at the Doha conference said, we're doing very well. It has taken us 3 hours to do one paragraph. At this stage, it would take 784 days. These blocking mechanisms of the powerful and the countries that were representing the powerful and representing unaccountable multinationals cannot destroy the important conferences that are coming up this year. The post-2015 conference in September in New York, the climate change conference in December in Paris. And I'm finishing. I should tell those who are getting concerned. For these processes to succeed, a new approach is required, as I've said, in how the North, so-called, addresses the South, through the multilateral system, but also in the globalized economic system. As well, there is a great demand for institutional change. Institutions, for example, the manner in which the head of the International Monetary Fund is replaced, the World Trade Organization or any of these, this kind of seamless change and so forth, will, I believe, change very, very radically. I think success depends on reconciling the discourse of rights with the discourse of development in those conferences, and reconciling those discourses in a way that makes space for the voices and the perspective of those most wounded and marginalized on our planet. And I am beginning to get weary of the phrase marginalized, because it assumes that there is something that is perfect, when in fact it isn't. And I think the whole world is in fact to be remade. Who experience the sharp end, however, when I have messages from islands who are already affected by rising sea levels. But it defines the challenges for us all who are concerned with human rights, development, justice, and solidarity. I so wish you all well for today's seminar, And I view it as part of a national discussion in Ireland about ethics. I'm very grateful to the university and to those people who are participating in the ethics discussion that I launched just over a year and a half ago. But also, I would encourage you to be vigorous participants in the wider international discussion about the values and priorities of human society as we aim to set global standards and different standards and more hopeful standards for future generations. Garamila Mahaki, thank you.
President Higgins, Mrs. Higgins, President Brown, colleagues, on behalf of Diarmuid O'Donovan of the School of Medicine and myself indeed on behalf of the Irish Centre for Human Rights, I would like to thank you, President Higgins, very warmly for your opening address to us today. Far more than the brief words of introduction that we thought we may receive, and indeed a profound framing of everything that will take place over the next few hours. We're also especially grateful that you allowed us, President Higgins, to locate this event within the context of the President's Ethics Initiative that not only raises the status and significance of our event, but also gives us a challenge and a responsibility. I think as an element of the initiative, we cannot just have a grand conversation. We have to change society. And so we begin a dialogue today, which we hope will have a profound and real impact for the well-being of people in health systems, both here in Ireland and more broadly. We welcome the way you framed the discussion for us today. You have set out for us a vision of fair and just societies, interconnected societies, within which we have to rethink just about everything, not least the economic models. You've reminded us, and we're most grateful, of the extent to which there is an important role for human rights within the rethinking of our societies. You've set out a vision of human rights as a vehicle through which our people can be empowered, they can be given access to essential services, and justice can be delivered. And albeit you don't like the term marginalised, nevertheless, this is the framework within which those who are most vulnerable in our society are most likely to attain the empowerment and the access and the justice that we all aspire to. You've reminded us that it's not going to work if human rights stays in its legal silo. I can assure you that the Irish Centre for Human Rights is very firmly of that view, and indeed that is why we are collaborating with the School of Medicine today to engage on this issue. Left to the lawyers, nothing much ever is going to happen on this. Within the context of human rights, President Higgins, you have already recalled for us the extent to which human rights is as much about economic, social and cultural matters as it is the civil and the political. And while not taking a view as to whether we should enshrine economic, social and cultural rights in the Constitution, you have reminded us that regardless of where we put them in our legal framework, they cannot be ignored. And as I would recall, in any case, since 1990, they've been legally binding on Ireland through its ratification of the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And then finally, in terms of the delivery of this legally binding corpus of economic, social and cultural rights, you drew our attention to the human right to the highest attainable standard of health care, as it's termed in the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and reminded us of the duty to find ways to deliver on that right, both locally and internationally. And that then brings us very tightly and closely to our subject today, an exploration of exactly that issue. It's an exploration in a context of grave crisis. We're very familiar of the daily headlines and disturbing stories within the context of Irish healthcare, but we can go well beyond that to recognise that we're confronting a global problem of a failure to deliver adequate healthcare for those who are most in need of it in our societies internationally. As we discuss these topics today, I very much hope we'll pick up on some of the elements that you've brought to our attention. For example, and very immediately, the extent to which human rights will be incorporated in the Sustainable Development Goals, which are coming close to, the negotiation of which is coming close to completion in the United Nations. And of course also, we will come local. we must talk about human rights and the human right to the highest attainable levels of healthcare in our own state and indeed in our own towns and villages where we live, where we get sick and where hopefully we also get better. And so, President, thank you very much indeed for your very strong framing of our conference. I do make you the assurance that with our colleagues gathered here today and within our institutions in the School of Medicine and in the Irish Centre for Human Rights, we are determined to turn the fine talk of today into the impact on policy of tomorrow. And we have you to thank for providing the platform.